basically I want to talk about, having read the Western press over the last weeks, 4 myths about Ukrainian politics that have emerged from the headlines about the elections. So I'll start with one. Quote, following the apparent victory of Yanukovych, Ukraine heads back into the arms of Mother Russia. So, of course, the assumption here is that Yanukovych is some Kremlin stooge who will give away the store, that his sympathies are more with Moscow than they are with Kiev, and so on, which I just think are false. And here there are 3 points to be made. One, there's a difference between cultural sympathies and policy preferences. So clearly his cultural sympathies are somewhat different than the outgoing president's. However, his policy preferences don't necessarily accord with those cultural sympathies. Second is his track record as prime minister in 2006, 2007. And as Jim can attest, Jim Green that is, cooperation with Western institutions and in particular, in Jim's case, NATO, did not cease overnight. In fact, to a certain extent, I believe they were more effective under Yanukovych's prime ministership than they were, or at least as. And the third point is that really, at the end of the day, he represents a group of economic interests, and as a result is somewhat of an economic nationalist, in the sense that the people behind him don't want to compete with Russian oligarchs on their markets, and to a certain extent, that's what the Kremlin wants, and he's not going to give it to them. So, a second myth, that the election represents, quote, the death of the Orange Revolution. So here, the assumption is that the Orange Revolution was fundamentally about the victory of the politicians who were associated with it. So the fact that Yushchenko and Tymoshenko are now really not going to be playing the first roles in Ukraine's political life means that the revolution is over. So I think this is also a false both assumption, and the headline is, incorrect in the sense that the revolutionaries in 2004, 2005 were not Tymoshenko and Yushchenko. They were average Ukrainians who were revolting against the stagnation of the post-Soviet period. And really, as I'm sure all of you know, Ukrainian society before 2005 was largely typical of the region, resigned to be ruled from above, incapable of self-organization, and somewhat closed to the outside world, whereas now it's been completely transformed. And that's obvious to anyone who's been there before and after. But this sea change, I think, is harder to pick up for outside observers than the binary political battle between the democratic politicians and the non-democratic politicians. In fact, Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, as their actions over the last 5 years have demonstrated, are anything but pure Democrats, as we understand it. They're a product of the Kuchma era and maintain the habits and modus operandi of the elite that emerged from that period. Essentially, they were in the right place at the right time, and the Orange Revolution wasn't about them. A third myth is that, and this hasn't been promulgated today by any of the panelists, but see it in the headlines, that the elections were conducted freely and fairly shows that Ukraine is a democracy. Well, the elections being conducted freely and fairly shows that Ukraine knows how to conduct free and fair elections, I would say. These are that's a key component of a democracy, but it's not enough to make Ukraine a democracy, period, or a democracy without adjectives, doing so blinds us to major problems that have continued to exist over the last 5 years. We've talked a lot about the legal system today, and I think that's, pretty much the most important and critical component that is pretty much absolutely missing, along with the rule of law. And the examples over the last couple of weeks are certainly paralleled, are not new. Just a year and a half ago, Yushchenko abolished a court that had, when there was about to be another election called, or that almost happened, that had annulled one of his decrees, and then after 3 days he reversed his decision, and an hour later he had second thoughts about that decision and created 2 new courts to replace the one that had ruled against him. Anyway, so I think when looking at this, there's using the term democracy often sort of obscures more than it illuminates. The term, and used in political science, a guy named Thomas Carruthers came up with it, mostly to refer to Latin America, called feckless pluralism. Tell me if this doesn't sound familiar. Countries whose political life is marked by feckless pluralism tend to have significant amounts of political freedom, regular elections, and alternation of power between genuinely different political groupings. Despite these positive features, however, democracy remains shallow and troubled. Political participation, though broad at election time, extends little beyond voting. Political elites from all the major parties or groupings are widely perceived as corrupt, self-interested, and ineffective. The alternation of power seems only to trade the country's problem back and forth from one hapless side to another. Political elites from all the major parties, the public is seriously disaffected from politics, and while it still may cling to a belief in the ideal of democracy, it is extremely unhappy about the political life of its country. Overall, politics is widely seen as stale, corrupt, elite-dominated, and that it delivers little good to the country and commands equally little respect. And the state remains persistently weak. Economic policy is often poorly conceived and executed, and economic performance is frequently bad or even calamitous. Sounds familiar. Social and political reforms are similarly tenuous, and successive governments are unable to make headway on most of the major problems facing the country, from crime to corruption to health to education and public welfare generally. Seems to fit pretty well. So I think to say that it's not a democracy without adjectives, that is Ukraine, is not to deny the major achievements that have occurred over the past 5 years. It's just to acknowledge the real problems that do continue to exist, and to ensure that we don't become complacent about them. And also, it's important to make the point that, as Carruthers does, feckless pluralism might be an equilibrium. That is, there's no guarantee that there's a natural progression towards consolidated democracy. In fact, there's the possibility of backsliding, and we should keep that in mind. Finally, the fourth myth, that Ukraine is hopelessly divided between East and West. And you see charts like this being, all over the place. And so it's true that real regional differences do exist, and particularly in perceptions of history, Ukraine's historical origins, and in foreign policy preferences. But that doesn't tell the whole story and doesn't really capture important dynamics that show why Ukraine is not just about a regional divide. First of all, values tend to be, in public opinion surveys, tend to be more determined by socioeconomic conditions rather than regional differences. However, they tend to correlate. So really, regional differences are epiphenomenal or occur at the same time as socioeconomic conditions. So they mask real determinants of values. Second, people vote on personality often and not based on regional affiliations in a country with weak political parties. And on critical issues that really will determine Ukraine's future, region doesn't matter. That is, feelings of patriotism, for example. Vast majorities in the South, West, Center, and East respond positively to the question, are you a patriot of Ukraine? And that share has increased from 2003 to 2008. Adherence to liberal values and norms. Both the West, Center, and South, and East all demonstrate approximately equal support for political and economic liberalism. The data also show that there's virtually no support for the idea that increasing Russianness in the linguistic sphere is associated with anti-reformist attitudes.